difference and acceptance. During the bus ride from Amherst, Mass. To Providence, for my interview in the spring of 1971, I was suffering from a hangover. I also suffer from motion sickness. Disheveled and shocked, I asked myself, how will I ever get through this? When Dr. Rene Fortin picked me up at the train station, he began to settle me down with his wit and honesty. He introduced me to Dr. Rodney Della Santa and Dr. John Hennedy. And in the new Civ office in Aquinas Hall, while John Hennedy, by the way, was eating a ham sandwich on white bread, I had my interview. The level of intellectual exchange concerning poetry and its teaching compelled me absolutely. I met Dr. Brian Barber, and his comments on Faulkner and Amy Lowell also intrigued me. After a hectic visit when Dr. Fortin drove me to the train station, I asked him quite a direct question. How will I fit in? To which he replied, Jane, it's Providence. We laughed. I think of these words so often whenever I'm confronted with a goal that I can't achieve or one that I have achieved and I'm grateful for. I do believe I was meant to come to Providence College, where I've grown as a poet, as a feminist, and by the way, if you believe in equal pay for equal work, you are a feminist. So let's just put that right over there. And I've grown as a lifelong student of the Holocaust and as a spiritual seeker. My question to Dr. Fortin was about difference. I believed then, and I still believe now, that people were interested in me and disinterested in me because I am Jewish. I'm one of the first females to teach at PC. What kept me going in quasi-isolation was that I felt truly committed as a member, a team member of the English department. I believe then and still believe that the department is completely dedicated to helping students reach the highest level of insights into literature and the pursuit of creative writing. Although I was not socially at ease in the beginning, for heaven's sakes, I received a Christmas party invitation addressed to me and my wife. I did meet 6 incredible Dominicans who taught me a lot about difference and acceptance. Reverend Dominic Rover, OP, Reverend George Leonard Cochran, OP, Reverend Thomas Fallon, OP, Reverend John Fabian Cunningham, OP, and Reverend Edward Doyle, OP. And I see that Father Peterson, I forgot to put you on my list, but you're on my list. Father Rover and Father Fallon and Father Cochran were all poets and scholars. I could talk to them 24 hours straight. Father Rover and Father Fallon came to love me and my husband and celebrated Passover Seders with our family. Father Cunningham, as you know, was president of the college from 85 to 94. And he was compelled to engage with me for a whole year on whether it was wise or unwise for Providence College to have a women's studies program. Now, we had a very unofficial women's studies program, and I see the faces of the women and the men who were involved. And if I start telling the stories about trying to write the proposal and not use the word feminism, I'm just going to, break into tears. So I'm not going to do that, but I love you all. What I want to say, what I want to summarize, is that Fabian Cunningham really and truly was interested in interdisciplinary scholarship and understood that women's studies cuts through, combines all the disciplines, and uses gender, race, class, age, physical condition, ethnicity, nationality, religion, to evaluate the achievements and challenges of women from ancient to contemporary times, including women religious. And so he said to me, after many discussions, I have indeed decided to approve this, and you will be the program's first director. To which I replied, but how do you know you can trust me? And that again was Providence. You have to hear this story about Father Cunningham, because it's really his fascination for life and his humor that are so much a part of this. He was being nagged by his buddies, his fellow priests, that his attire was not clean enough, that he ought to get to the basement of the dorm and put his laundry in the washing machine. This he confided to me. And he did so, and then he went out and decided he'd do some reading. It was a spring day. And when he came back, the dryer was gone, the washer was gone, and the clothes were gone. He laughed. He cried. The company, the leasing company, had taken the machines away. We went hysterical. It's just something perhaps only a philosopher and a poet could laugh and cry about together. Among the group of my friends was Father Doyle, who was a chaplain and liberator of Mauthausen concentration camp in the Army's division of Timberwolves. He took Polaroid snapshots of the carnage he found and the other liberators found. And when he was getting ready to pass on, he came to my office, a leprechaun in a bowler hat, with a golden ambassador candy box filled with these original photos. And he charged me with taking them from him and making them physically available at PC. And when I said, how do you know you can trust me? Why don't you give them to the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum? He said, I want everyone here at Providence College to know that the Holocaust happened. And although I have never been able to attain a public space for them, they remain in the archives for students to use in their research. What I learned from these four priests was total acceptance of difference. Every stereotype we had concerning one another dissolved in our friendships. This is what René Fortin meant by its providence. Now, there is one more Dominican father I need to include here who was not yet a Dominican priest when I arrived. That would be Reverend President Brian Shanley, OP, who was my student in the liberal arts honors course, Dimensions of Art, which I team taught with the fabulous painter Jim Baker, who has already retired. Father Shanley was so immersed in poetry and quite taken with the work of Denise Levertov. His insights were remarkable. He was a true contemplative, and I began to worry about him. It couldn't have been more than 1974. I knew his mother. We shared conversations in the library. I just couldn't imagine, with his deeply aesthetic intellect, spiritual nature, his going into his father's business, not to demean that business by any means. So, of course, because it's Providence, what does he do? He goes into his father's business with a capital Fathers. I was happy for him. We still share our love of poetry, and what a journey we have shared. Next, refuting sexism. For this, you need a drink of water. This is true. My first day of teaching, September 1971, I was coming down the stairs in the library dressed in what I thought was a conservative manner, in a beige dress emblazed with stampeding zebras. My hair was extremely full, and I was wearing large zebra earrings, matchy-matchy. Walking downstairs, I encountered a priest who took one look at me, stumbled, and fell down the stairs. With concern, I jumped down the stairs, bent over him to try to help him, and saw him literally shrink away from me. I immediately went for help. I was so shook up from this event that I phoned my mother, who was to die 4 years later. And she said, "That's all right, honey. It can only get better." Shortly after that, I was in the faculty lounge in Harkins when a male colleague walked up to me and, as they say, invaded my personal space and quipped, "I like what you're wearing." To which I replied in that same sort of voice, "I like what you're wearing too." Vexed, he turned around and left. That became my pattern. I would never get angry, but I would mimic the sexist behavior in an effort to show how its attention was overbearing. I was disinterested in discussing a situation unless the perpetrator was relentless. I never refrained from speaking to someone who had behaved in that way. I think over time, many of the men and even some of the women who wanted to stereotype me, after all, I was only 25 years old when I started teaching, realized that they just could not rattle me or keep me from trying to be honest, to look past their uncalled for behavior. Sometimes it took 20 years for people who had insulted me and then chosen to disregard my friendliness to come around. But I was patient. Also, over time, I was one of very few familiar faces that these people still recognized. So to me, refuting sexism is done through the scholarship of women's studies by using gender as an analytical category to evaluate human behavior, offering programming to educate the college community, and also it comes from just being who you are, having a sense of humor, not becoming like your oppressor. And finally, when you can't break the pattern, letting people know calmly how and why they are offensive. In fact, I once wrote an actual letter to a colleague who every time I sat at a table in the cafeteria would make a comment about my body along the lines of, "Oh, you've put on weight. Oh, you've put on more weight." After he received my letter, requesting that he not make my body part of the luncheon conversation, he wrote back an extremely apologetic letter. He was completely unaware of the effect of his behavior. While not all sexism is unconscious, this particular instance it was, and we maintained friendship until his death. Collaborating with students. Collaboration, student agency, and faculty humility in interdisciplinary learning. And I'm going to try to compress this for you. In the 42 years that I've been here, the greatest joy I think that I've had is realizing the value of student agency in the classroom and the compact that we share. I'm extremely fortunate that I know the limits of my own knowledge. I have never professed to be a scholar, although I am scholarly. Primarily, I am a poet whose longing to understand what it means to be human, I believe, humbles me. I do not want my students to look at me as a parent, nor do I claim to be superior because my knowledge is often different than theirs. I have recognized that students know much more than I and that we know differently and about different aspects of living and experience. So why is this important and why does it inform my teaching? As a student, I was very awkward and overwhelmed by the genius of my teachers. But the teachers I remember sat in dialogue with me so that our discussion of literary texts were collaborations of thought. They did not ask a set of questions about a discourse they wanted to know in addition to their own questions, what questions and insights I had. They validated me. This is how I am humbled by students, that in addition to what I want them to know, there is a whole world of their own interest, insights, originality that flows into discussion both in and out of the classroom. My model of the professor-student relationship is not that the professor alone gives wisdom to those who lack knowledge, but it is the interplay of knowledges among the students in the class and the professor. This is a great gift to me, and it gives students freedom to do the work required and go beyond that with encouragement. A wonderful example of these ideas is when you teach interdisciplinary studies. Students are bound to have different perspectives, depending on their majors, depending on their identities. Diana Vlavianos, who was kind enough to introduce me, comes to mind. When she took creative writing and poetry with me, I had the students read several articles and many poems from the interdisciplinary faculty seminar sponsored by the Center for Teaching Excellence I participated in, entitled Blood. This material ignited in Diana the desire to do more on the research on the Nazi slaughter of all the males in the Greek village of Kalavrita. Diana is Greek, and her grandparents had described to her what happened. She wrote an amazing poem based on the material she read from the Blood seminar. Her grandparents' story and her own research entitled No More Men. I want to read just an excerpt from her poem for you. No More Men, based on the Kalavrita massacre on the Greek island of Kalavrita, December 13, 1943. The honey-haired demons were bathing in tubs, sloshing with blood of the weathered faces of our nation. They polluted our blue sea, our white foam, with toxic crimson ink, pouring buckets of ruby wine into our crystal urn. They flooded us to the brim, crimson seeping through the damp ground, oozing out whitewashed walls. Even young faces were strained with red juices of unfamiliar berries smeared across smooth cheeks. A sea full of rotting flesh torn to pieces by frothing canines of the Aryan breed. Corpses reeking of dead donkey adorned our island on a Sunday afternoon. I read only the beginning here to share with you Diana's powerful imagery of atrocity. This is the horror in this poem is blistering. Total immersion into interdisciplinary studies stirred Diana, fired her creativity, but also how Diana's identity as a Greek was steeped in the loss of all the men in that village. She connected to history, to atrocity, to family memory, and help me expand as a witness to the indelible power of loss and love that writing poetry produces in poets, and how that honors victims of past horrors. With the cruelest irony, it underscores the need for belief and political action to preserve the sanctity of life and the primacy of human rights. I knew these truths intellectually, but Diana's poem deepened my knowledge and moved my spirit in new ways. I cannot say enough about the collaboration and interdisciplinary learning, whether it is done in the privileged setting of the IFS, of the CTE, or directly in the classroom with our students. The nature the exchange embraces, in my thinking, is the highest form of learning. Recognizing and encouraging student agency with the respect for differences in experience and kinds of knowledge allows professors to be more open to students' originality and to share what is exceptional. My thanks go to the director of the Center of Teaching Excellence, Dr. Laurie Grupp, and her committee, and to the chair of Art History and Associate Dean of the School of Arts and Sciences, Dr. Joan Branham, who was also the chair of the Blood Seminar, and to my colleagues who participated in that seminar. And one last bullet here, imagination and spirituality. Hired as a poet, I have a particular advantage. Most people are inclined to leave me alone. Poetry is the least understood of all the literary genres and really makes many faculty and students terribly nervous. So much of it has to do with someone teaching you poetry who themselves is scared to death of it and will blurt out the question, "What does it mean?" even before he or she gets to walk around inside the poem and figure out who's talking about what. I have tried to make students comfortable walking around inside poems. Once that degree of comfort is achieved, the reader can begin to appreciate the original use of language and thought, and yes, think about the possible meanings that one can find. And in the tone of the poem, one can find a prayer-like symmetry and sound. Even angry poems seem like prayers to me to stop the oppression that causes the anger. Think of Diana's poem in this regard. The human spirit cannot be fed on historical facts alone. It longs for love, acceptance, and the experience of devotion. Without imagination, we learn that Moses had a lisp and was not an obvious leader. When we imagine his lisping and his conflict, that he was not good enough to bring the word of God down from Mount Sinai, then we are involved with our own limitations as human beings and sense how God lifted him up. You might not know this about me, but I am fascinated with Mary. Although I am Jewish, I am extremely interested in her life, or maybe it's because I am Jewish, I don't know. When I try to imagine the Annunciation, I am swept away by the vision of Gabriel's announcing Mary's destiny and the simplicity of her acceptance. Without imagination, that moment can never seem real. And though to me Jesus is a rabbi and not my personal savior, I am overwhelmed by the spiritual power of that moment. When I consider suffering, whether it be that of Moses, Mary, her sons, or any other human beings we hear daily about who are murdered because of their nationalities, religions, or sexual orientations, I am involving my imagination, and that which is prayerful in me pleads for the suffering to stop. In that pleading, my spirit is praying to the author of the universe that I may be given understanding of how to honor life in a brutal world. For me, art, history, religion, all are imbued with imagination and the human need for peace in a world in which love thy neighbor as thyself is the way to live. A poet lives in two worlds, the world of the body that summons the world of the spirit, and through imagination and seeking a spiritual path in which the highest form of wisdom is kindness, a poet like me can survive and even flourish here at Providence College. I'd like to end by thanking the college for allowing me the journey and honoring me with it that I have had, and for giving me the opportunity to re-examine my Jewish heritage in a Catholic context. The poem I'm going to read to you now is called A Jew in Cairo. And it's about a trip that my dear husband, without whom I would never be here at this moment, and I took in 2008. And I had just had a sarcoma the size of a baseball removed from right above my sternum. And I decided to take the trip anyway. And I did a lot of relaxing and listening to the music, the museums, singing. And in Red Radio Heart, Carnelia is the persona I've chosen to write in, and Morton's I call Ari. Carnelia and Ari are staying in a Carnelia and Ari are staying in Cairo at a hotel on the Nile. 4 weeks ago, she had a sarcoma the size of a baseball removed from the center of her chest. But she insisted on traveling. How many more trips do she and Ari have? Her scar sings a spinning gypsy song to her of blades and violins. She has vowed to have only one adventure each day, to rest and accompany Ari to dinner. This late afternoon, she is reading Laila Ahmed on the patio when the muezzins begin their prayer. Their voices, hibiscus-soaked, spiral in the sunset. Wheels of rose gold explode into flames, singeing blue streaks of sky that pulse like tendons in the wings of the angel Gabriel. 4 white birds fly by, reminding Carnelia to return to her body. When she bows her head, the muezzin's voices ignite in her. She has a God rush, the God who forgives her for scratching in the ashes of her own annihilation. She forgives herself for having turned away. The prayer rises from the supplicant's intestines, then rolls over the sky, ballooning down into the Nile, into Nas's silt, into today's filth. Then it revives and sails back into the light. Anubis the jackal lifts it from the mud. 4 white birds fly by, reminding Carnelia to return to her body. Still, the voices of all the muezzins anoint her, a silkworm spinning strands of gold and folding her over and over. Carnelia, a breathing mummy restored from her own embalming. 4 white birds fly by, reminding Carnelia to revere her body. Her bones are now lutes. Her heart is newly wrapped. It is fixed and fired in the oven of the sun, replaced in her body by the black glove of the moon. To Carnelia, all of creation is now the one voice of the people, adoring the Creator, swaying above the sirens, tearing the air into twisted metal. A surgeon's hand reached inside Carnelia blading out the cancer, saving her for this moment. 4 white birds fly by, reminding Carnelia to chant the blessing. Blessed art thou, O God, who gives us life, who sustains us, and who has brought us to this moment.